They said it would be just for a while, but that was 3 years ago. And now my own living room feels like a waiting room where I am tolerated out of obligation. The first time I realized something inside this house had shifted was the afternoon my grandson lifted his eyes from his phone and said, without even looking at me, "You're blocking my view, Grandma." I was standing near the window, watering a fern that used to belong to my daughter, and for a moment I thought he was joking, that maybe he'd grin the way he did when he was small and tell me to move a little because of the glare on the screen. But there was no grin, no kindness, just impatience. That thin tone young people reserve for slow cashiers and malfunctioning elevators. "You're blocking my view," he said again. And the absurd thing was that I was in my own living room, the room my husband George painted with his own hands. 47 years ago, the room where my daughter took her first steps, where I danced once, barefoot, when I thought no one was watching. I moved aside anyway. That's what startled me most. Not his words, but my reaction. I moved as if I were the guest, and he were the host. I am 82 years old. I live in the same 2-story house on Maple Street that George and I built when the neighborhood was still a stretch of dirt roads and young trees. The oak outside my window was a sapling when we planted it. Now it towers higher than the roof, roots thick and deep enough to lift the pavement. Sometimes I think it's the only living thing here that still remembers me. The house smells faintly of varnish and lemon cleaner now, not the way it used to when bread was always baking and George smoked his pipe by the window. My daughter, bless her, would have filled these rooms with laughter, but she's been gone for nearly a decade. Cancer took her quietly, the way she lived, with dignity that broke my heart to witness. Her husband, Mark, moved in after her funeral, bringing their son, Ethan, who was 14 then, awkward and shy, all bones and headphones. I said yes to it, of course. A house feels hollow after a child dies. I told myself it would be good to have company again, to hear the sound of another person's footsteps, to make breakfast for someone besides myself. I told myself I was lucky to still be needed. The first year was easy enough. Grief softened the edges of everything, and I thought of them as survivors just like me. I made pancakes, and Mark repaired a few things around the house, and Ethan would sometimes sit at the table doing homework, tapping his pencil against his teeth, asking about my childhood in Kansas. He used to call me Grandma M, short for Emily, which sounded like music to me. Back then, we were a small, damaged family trying to heal under one roof. I thought we were doing well. But grief has a way of curdling if you leave it unattended, and by the second year, the house began to change in ways I couldn't quite name. It started with small, reasonable suggestions. Mark said it would be easier if he handled the bills since online banking is complicated. I agreed. Then he offered to update the decor. He said it would make the house feel lighter, less heavy with memory. He took down George's paintings and replaced them with framed prints of oceans and minimalist lines. Neutral, he said, is modern. He moved my old rocking chair to the garage, just until we find a better spot. He never did. I told myself it didn't matter. People redecorate all the time. Change is normal, healthy even. The living room became sleeker, colder. One evening, I noticed he'd moved the television to the opposite wall, right where the piano used to be. "Better lighting," he said. "Less glare." I didn't notice at first how the language in the house shifted too. It was no longer your house, it was the house. No longer Grandma's room, but the guest room. No one asked before rearranging things. They informed. I went along with it because peace seemed easier than pride. And at 82, you start to pick your battles like ripe fruit. You only reach for the ones that are worth the stretch. But slowly, invisibly, I was becoming a shadow inside the place I built. Ethan, my sweet boy, changed the fastest. Teenagers do, I suppose. His shoulders broadened, his voice dropped, and one day he stopped sitting at the table with me. He started eating in front of the television. At first I joined him, balancing my plate on my knees, trying to follow the movies he liked. But he wore headphones now, wireless ones, the kind that glow blue in the dark. So we sat together, but apart, sharing space but not sound. The last real conversation we had was about his driver's test. I told him how his mother stalled 3 times before finally passing. He laughed politely, then looked back at his phone. "That's wild, Grandma," he said, and that was that. Mark works long hours at some firm downtown. He's polite in that mechanical way of people who manage to seem kind without ever being warm. He leaves notes instead of conversations, sticky reminders on the fridge about deliveries, appointments, groceries. Sometimes he signs them M, as if I might confuse him with someone else. Last Christmas, he bought me a tablet because everyone FaceTimes now. I thanked him, though I barely touch it. I still have the rotary phone George wired himself, heavy and beige and solid enough to survive an earthquake. No one calls it anymore, but I can't bring myself to unplug it. It's the last voice of the old world that still rings. I keep thinking about that afternoon by the window, the blocking my view moment, as I've started calling it in my head. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was indifference, which is worse. Cruelty has heat, intention. Indifference is cold air filling every room. He didn't even mean to wound me. I was just in the way, a piece of furniture between him and his television. That's what stayed with me. How ordinary it was. How easy. And how quickly I obeyed, moving my fragile frame aside like mist. I didn't even say a word. I wanted to. I wanted to remind him that this was my house, that his mother once sat in that very spot watching cartoons on a clunky box TV with rabbit ears. But the words lodged in my throat like a splinter. It wasn't fear. It was futility. I could tell by his eyes he wasn't really seeing me. That night I went to bed early. The walls in my room are still the same pale yellow George chose decades ago, a color he said looked like sunlight, even in winter. I ran my hand over the headboard we built together from oak we cut ourselves. Every notch in the wood tells a story. I whispered good night to him out of habit, then lay awake for hours listening to the muffled sounds of the television downstairs, the laughter from shows I didn't recognize, the hum of a refrigerator that now holds food I didn't buy. When I closed my eyes, I saw my grandson's face lit by that blue glow of his phone, the faint reflection of the screen dancing in his eyes. I thought about how time doesn't just pass. It erases, one polite request at a time. You stop being the host and become the help. You stop being seen and become tolerated. You stop being loved and become background noise. I thought about my daughter and how she would have hated this, how she would have snapped at him for speaking to me that way, how she used to insist on dinner at the table every night, no screens allowed. She understood the sanctity of a shared meal, of presence. But she isn't here to defend me, and I've forgotten how to defend myself. Outside, the wind rattled the window frames. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm cried out and then fell silent. I thought of that old oak tree again, the one George and I planted when we were still young enough to believe roots were forever. Its branches scraped the siding sometimes, like it's trying to knock, to remind me that not everything forgets its beginning. Maybe that's why I haven't moved out, even when Mark suggested it last spring, saying I'd be more comfortable in a smaller place. He meant cheaper. He meant invisible. But I smiled and said I was perfectly comfortable where I was. I don't know what keeps me here, honestly. Habit, memory, or sheer defiance. Maybe all three. I still polish the picture frames on the mantel every Sunday. I still sweep the porch, even though no one sits there anymore. I still buy lemons for pies I no longer bake. Because leaving would mean surrendering the last evidence that I ever mattered. People say old age makes you invisible. That's not true. It's not the years that erase you. It's the people who stop looking. So when Ethan told me I was blocking his view, I moved aside. But later, when the house went dark and their laughter faded behind closed doors, I stood by the same window again and looked out into the street. The glass reflected a ghost of my own face, lined, pale, but still mine. I realized I wasn't blocking his view at all. He was blocking mine. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop moving aside. It happened on a Sunday morning that smelled of burnt toast and quiet resentment. One of those mornings when the house feels too small for all the unspoken things floating through it. Mark was sitting at the kitchen counter, tapping on his laptop, the screen reflecting in his glasses like two little mirrors that didn't let me see his eyes. Ethan was upstairs, probably still in bed, though he would claim he was studying. I was at the sink, rinsing dishes that weren't mine, because old habits have muscle memory stronger than pride. The coffee had gone cold in my cup, and I was debating whether to pour a fresh one when Mark cleared his throat in that way men do before they're about to turn your world into paperwork. He said, almost casually, that he'd been talking to a realtor about options. I asked what kind of options, and he said it so smoothly I almost didn't hear the violence in it. For downsizing, he said. Something easier for you, Em. He called me Em the way people say dear when they mean nuisance. At first I laughed, thinking it was a misunderstanding, the way older people often do when they sense the tremor beneath the floor, but convince themselves it's just the pipes. I'm not planning to move, I said lightly, drying my hands on a dish towel. This house fits me just fine. He didn't look up. He said something about property taxes being unrealistic for someone on a fixed income, and how maintenance was becoming too much for me. You shouldn't have to worry about leaks and repairs at your age, he added, pretending concern. I told him there was nothing to worry about, that the house was solid, and that George built it with his own hands. Yes, Mark said, closing his laptop with a quiet click. But George isn't here anymore, is he? The sentence landed like a slap. I turned away so he wouldn't see the color drain from my face. It wasn't the cruelty of it. It was the calculation. He knew exactly what he was doing, drawing a line between past and present, between belonging and burden. I stood there, holding the dish towel, feeling the air in the kitchen thicken. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would slice through his careful tone, but my throat locked. He went on, explaining that he'd looked into some options and that there were lovely senior residences just outside of town, bright, safe, full of amenities. You'd have your own room, your privacy, he said, as if I were a teenager negotiating curfew. It took me a full minute to find my voice. Mark, I said finally, keeping my tone steady, this is my house. I'm not leaving. He smiled, the kind of smile that people wear when they think they're talking to someone who doesn't understand the full picture. Of course, Em, he said. No one's making decisions today. I just want what's best for everyone. Everyone. The word echoed. It didn't mean me. It meant him and his son, the ones who already lived here like owners. When he left for work later that morning, I went into the living room and stood by the bookshelf. My hands were shaking slightly, but not from weakness, from clarity. I opened the small drawer under the stereo cabinet where George used to keep spare screws and found the folder I'd tucked there years ago, the one with the house deed, insurance papers, and the last tax statement. I hadn't looked at them in ages because there had never been a reason to. The house was mine. That was as certain as sunrise. I carried the folder to the dining table and opened it carefully, smoothing the papers flat. My name stared back at me in black ink. Emily Porter, sole owner. Below it, a neat signature from a lawyer long dead, a notary stamp fading at the edges. It was all there, just as it had been since the day George and I paid off the final mortgage check with a celebration dinner of takeout Chinese food and cheap champagne. I sat there for a long time, staring at that document, my hands resting lightly on either side as though steadying something fragile. Somewhere above, I could hear Ethan's footsteps crossing the floor, the thud of a door, the faint rhythm of music leaking through headphones. I wondered if he had any idea what his father was planning. Probably not. Or worse, maybe he did and didn't care. I folded the deed back into its envelope and placed it under my blouse, close to my chest, as if paper could be armor. That afternoon I went for a walk. The air was brittle with the first bite of autumn. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk like nervous thoughts. I walked slowly down Maple Street, passing houses that used to belong to friends now long gone. At the corner, Mrs. Holt's old place was for sale again. Her children had moved her into assisted living last spring, and within 2 months the house was gutted, repainted, and flipped. Her rose bushes were gone. Her curtains, too. Just a hollow box now, waiting for strangers. I stood at the edge of her yard for a moment, staring at the for sale sign, and realized that this was what Mark saw when he looked at me. Real estate waiting to be repurposed. When I came home, the front door was locked. That was new. We never locked the front door during the day. I rang the bell, and Ethan opened it, looking surprised to see me standing there. "Dad said you were out," he said, half a question. "I was. You locked me out." He shrugged, stepping aside. "Sorry. It's just a habit." I walked past him, my heart hammering in my chest. A habit. That's what it starts as. Then one day, it's policy. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table. Ethan lingered for a moment, then drifted away, muttering something about homework. The kettle clicked softly as it cooled. I stared at the steam curling up from the mug and thought about George again. How he always said a house is more than walls. It's a promise you keep to yourself. That promise was being rewritten in front of me, line by line, by people who hadn't built any of it. That evening, after they'd both gone to bed, I went into the hallway and turned on the light above the front door. The brass plate that read "The Porters, Eastern 1978" gleamed faintly. I ran my fingers over the letters. Mark had talked once about updating it to match the new minimalist style of the house. I'd brushed it off as a joke. Now I realized he probably meant it. I could almost see the replacement in my mind. A sleek gray plaque with no names at all. A house stripped of history. The next morning brought more subtle rearrangements. My chair, the one I always sat in by the window, was gone. I found it later in the garage under a sheet. Just making space, Mark said when I asked. "The new TV's larger. We needed better angles." He said it like geometry, like logic, like a fact that couldn't be argued. Ethan didn't even look up from his cereal. I stood there, my hands trembling just slightly, and said nothing. Because the truth was dawning on me with a cold, clean clarity. This wasn't care or confusion. This was eviction, wrapped in politeness. That night, I called the number on the old lawyer's card I'd kept in my address book for decades, though I doubted it would still be valid. It wasn't. The man had died 10 years ago. But his firm still existed, and a young woman with a crisp voice answered. I told her my name, said I had questions about property documentation. She asked if I was looking to sell. I almost laughed. "No," I said quietly. "I'm trying to remember what's mine." After I hung up, I sat in the dark living room and listened to the refrigerator hum. The moonlight spilled across the hardwood floors, catching the dust in slow motion. Every corner of this house held a memory. George's laughter echoing through the hallway, the smell of apple pie cooling on the counter, the creak of the stairs when my daughter used to sneak out as a teenager. These memories were mine, but they were being erased one polite gesture at a time. Later that week, Mark brought home a glossy brochure and left it on the kitchen table. "Just something to look at," he said. On the cover, smiling elderly couples played shuffleboard under pastel umbrellas. Roseview Gardens, luxury retirement living. I opened it after he left the room. Every page was an advertisement for surrender. Shared dining halls, scheduled activities, controlled lives wrapped in gentle euphemisms. I imagined myself there, sitting among strangers, smiling at staff who called me sweetheart and served me pudding cups. I closed the brochure and placed it in the trash. Then I pulled it back out, folded it neatly, and slid it under a stack of magazines. Not because I was considering it, but because I wanted to keep a record of what they'd tried to do. The next morning, I overheard Mark on the phone in the hallway. He didn't know I was awake. His voice was low but clear. "She's still resisting," he said. "I'll handle it. She's getting forgetful, so it won't take much. We just need to make it official." I froze. The blood in my ears roared. Getting forgetful. That's how it begins. The language of dismissal disguised as concern. My fingers gripped the bedspread until my knuckles whitened. I waited until he left for work, then rose quietly, went to the hall closet, and retrieved the old lockbox George and I had used for important papers. I placed the deed inside along with my passport and a photograph of my daughter holding Ethan as a baby. Then I hid it under the loose floorboard in my bedroom, the one no one else knew about. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt like a warning. When dawn came, the first light slid across the dresser, touching the photograph of George in his Navy uniform. I sat up slowly and whispered, "They think I'm leaving, George, but I'm not. Not this time." The house was silent except for the wind through the oak branches. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel afraid. I felt awake. Something in me, something older than fear, older than politeness, had begun to stir. The quiet obedience that had carried me through decades of motherhood, widowhood, and loneliness was cracking like thin ice. I looked around the room, at the pale yellow walls, the careful stillness, and realized that what they called care was a slow theft, and I would not be stolen from. Not again. It's strange how theft can happen without a single thing being taken. You wake up one morning and everything looks the same. The curtains still sway in the same tired rhythm. The floor creaks in the same places. But something has already been moved inside you, quietly and without permission. After that Sunday, the house became a stage where every gesture carried an undertone. Nothing was said directly anymore. Everything arrived wrapped in suggestion, politeness, or that particular brand of silence that says more than words ever could. At first, Mark became overly attentive, as if to balance the coldness of his earlier proposal. He began to bring home flowers for the kitchen table, always bright, store-bought, unfragrant ones. He asked how I was feeling, if I needed groceries, if I'd taken my pills. His tone was soft but wrong, too measured, like he was practicing empathy instead of feeling it. The questions were not about me. They were about evidence, about establishing a narrative. I could almost hear the file forming in his mind. Declining, forgetful, compliant. Sometimes he would rest a hand on my shoulder when speaking, and I could feel the ownership in it, the gentle pressure of someone who believes they've already won. Ethan noticed the shift too, but differently. For him, it wasn't cruelty, it was permission. Once his father began treating me like a fragile relic, Ethan followed suit with the effortless cruelty of youth. He would walk into a room, see me sitting by the window, and put on his headphones as if my presence required noise cancellation. He no longer said good morning. When I tried to ask about school, he answered with one-word responses, or worse, with that blank stare reserved for screens and strangers. One evening, he brought 2 friends over without telling me. They sprawled across the couch, half laughing, half ignoring me while I tried to read in my chair. Someone asked who I was, and Ethan, without looking up, said, "Just my grandma. She lives here." Just. The word slid between my ribs. I told myself teenagers are careless, that this was a phase, that my daughter had raised him better than this. But every time I caught my reflection in the television screen, surrounded by voices that didn't hear me, I saw how invisible I had already become. It wasn't only the atmosphere that changed. Objects began to vanish. Small things first, the kind of absences you doubt yourself for noticing. The ceramic bird George bought me on our first trip to Vermont disappeared from the mantel. When I asked, Mark said it must have been knocked down during cleaning, but there were no shards, no evidence. Then the framed photo of my daughter from her college graduation was replaced by one of Ethan's soccer team. "We needed something more current," he said. "You can keep the old one upstairs if you want." Upstairs if you want. As though my memories had become clutter. I carried the photo up to my room and placed it on my nightstand. I began to think of my bedroom not as a retreat, but as the last border I could still defend. By winter, the pattern was set. Mark managed the bills, the house, and now the mail. Packages arrived that weren't for me, but bore my address. He'd thank me for signing for them, though I never had. He'd say things like, "It's simpler if all the accounts are under one name." I wanted to ask whose name, but I already knew. The utilities, the internet, even the property tax notifications, all began to arrive addressed to the Porter family household, not to me. Each envelope felt like a quiet erasure, as if I were being translated out of existence through administrative grammar. I tried, once, to reassert myself in the smallest way. I baked an apple pie the way my daughter used to love, crust flaky, cinnamon thick in the air, the smell filling the kitchen like memory itself. When Mark came home, he smiled, polite and distant. "Smells amazing," he said, though he didn't take a slice. Ethan said he was cutting sugar. I ended up eating one small piece alone at the table while the rest went cold. The next morning, the pie was gone. The dish washed and put away. Not a word. It was such a small thing, but it broke something in me. When you make something out of love and it disappears without acknowledgement, it's not about the pie. It's about proof that you still exist. Sometimes at night, I would walk through the house barefoot just to feel the floors I once paid for. The wood was cool and smooth under my soles, familiar. I'd stop in front of the window overlooking the oak tree and imagine George sitting beside me, newspaper folded on his knee. I'd whisper to him like I always did when no one could hear. "Can you believe what they're doing, George? Can you believe they've forgotten?" I used to think talking to the dead was a sign of madness. Now I think it's just another form of self-defense. Around February, Mark began dropping comments about safety concerns. He said the stairs were steep, that the bathtub was slippery, that he'd read statistics about elderly falls. He suggested installing railings and a shower seat. I told him not to bother. I've lived with those stairs for nearly half a century without incident. He smiled thinly and said, "Just being proactive." A week later, a handyman arrived unannounced to install handrails anyway. When I protested, Mark said, "You should be grateful. Not everyone has family who looks out for them." I thanked the handyman and paid him in cash from my own envelope before Mark could stop me. I wanted the record to show I wasn't dependent. Ethan's indifference hardened into something quieter, colder. He no longer called me Grandma at all. He avoided eye contact, even when we passed in the hallway. I would find his dishes in the sink, headphones on the counter, crumbs trailing like breadcrumbs from one room to another. Once, when I asked him to wipe the counter after himself, he sighed loudly and muttered, "It's not that deep." I asked what that meant, and he said, "Never mind." That was the first time I realized I didn't understand the language of the world he lived in anymore. He wasn't cruel in intention, only in practice. The kind of cruelty born from convenience. The final straw came on a Thursday evening in early March. I came into the living room and found the furniture rearranged again. My chair, the one that had returned from the garage, was now wedged between the bookshelf and the wall, facing nothing. The television, massive and new, dominated the room like an altar. Mark and Ethan were watching some sports event, plates balanced on their knees. I stood behind them for a moment, trying to find a place to sit. When I took a step forward, Ethan said it again in the same offhand tone as months ago, the tone that had started everything. "You're blocking the view, Grandma." He didn't even look back. Mark didn't correct him. He didn't say anything at all. The silence was its own endorsement. I went back to my room without a word. I sat on the bed for a long time, staring at the photograph of my daughter. I thought of her voice, warm and clear, how she used to tell me I was the strongest woman she knew. I wondered what she would have said if she'd seen her son speak to me like that. The tears came quietly, without drama, slipping down my face in slow surrender. But even as I cried, another part of me was taking inventory, not of things lost, but of things left. My name on the deed. The lawyer's number written on a notepad by the phone. The lockbox under the floorboard. My mind, still sharp, still mine. The next morning, I started keeping a small notebook. I wrote down everything, dates, conversations, changes in the house. I called it my ledger of small disappearances. At first, it was a way to steady myself, to make sense of the subtle gaslight that was creeping through my days. But soon, it became more than that. It was my evidence, my quiet rebellion. Every time Mark moved something or spoke in that patronizing tone, I recorded it in neat cursive. Every time Ethan ignored me, I noted it down. I was building a map of my own erasure, and maps, even of loss, have power. One afternoon, while dusting the bookshelf, I found a stack of unopened envelopes addressed to me but forwarded to Mark's email. They were from the bank, reminders about account updates and policy changes. When I confronted him, he smiled as if catching a child in a small lie. "You worry too much," he said. "I just simplified things. Everything's under one system now." I told him I wanted my mail forwarded back to me. He promised he would look into it. He never did. That night, I added another line to my notebook. Simplified means erased. By spring, I had learned the art of pretending. I smiled when he spoke about logistics, nodded when he mentioned long-term planning. I said thank you when he installed a smart thermostat that only he could control from his phone. I became quiet, agreeable, almost invisible on purpose. Because invisibility, I realized, is not always weakness. It can be camouflage. The more they underestimated me, the more room I had to think. I started calling numbers in secret, searching for legal aid, information on property rights. I learned words like life estate and trustee. I wrote them down carefully, like spells. The day I discovered the power bill had been transferred entirely to Mark's name, I didn't react. I simply noted it in the ledger. Later that night, I took out the deed again and traced my signature with my fingertip. I said it out loud, softly, as if reminding the house itself. Emily Porter, owner. The sound of my own name steadied me. The walls seemed to listen. Outside, the oak tree was beginning to bud again, small green shoots against the gray sky. Life returning, quietly, insistently. I pressed my palm to the window pane and whispered, "Not yet, George. They think they've won, but not yet." I watched the branches sway, stubborn and alive, and I knew that whatever they were building around me, whatever cage of politeness and paperwork they thought they could lock me in, they had forgotten one thing. The roots of this house go deep, and so do I. The shift began quietly, not with confrontation, but with a kind of internal click, the sound of something aligning after too long being out of place. It happened one evening in late spring, when the house was wrapped in that thick, bluish light that makes everything look both real and unreal at once. I had been cleaning the kitchen, not because it needed cleaning, but because motion kept me from thinking too hard. Mark and Ethan had gone out for dinner. "Just the two of us," Mark had said as he reached for his car keys, as if the words weren't a blade dressed in politeness. When the door shut behind them, the silence that filled the house was so complete it felt alive. I stood there, dish towel in hand, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the pulse of my own breath. And then, without knowing why, I walked to the cupboard above the sink, where I kept the old letter tin George used to call our safe. Inside were small relics of a life that once made sense. Birthday cards from my daughter, a yellowed bill from our first mortgage payment, the stub from the movie we'd gone to on our 40th anniversary, the night we both fell asleep halfway through. But tucked beneath all that, folded in a thin, brittle envelope, was the letter George had written me just weeks before he died. I hadn't opened it in years. I sat at the table and unfolded it slowly, the paper soft from age. His handwriting, sharp and certain, leapt from the page as if no time had passed at all. "M," it began, "if you're reading this, I hope you're sitting at our kitchen table, the one we nearly ruined building, the one that wobbles if you lean too hard. You've always leaned hard on the things you love. I've never minded that. Remember, the house is yours. Not just because of the papers we signed, but because you're the one who made it a home. Don't let anyone make you small inside it. I built these walls to hold you, not to cage you. I stopped reading there because my throat closed. The words were not advice. They were instruction. And I realized I had been disobeying them for years. I had let this place become a cage, and I was the one locking the door from the inside every time I stayed silent. I folded the letter again, kissed the corner, and tucked it into my pocket. Then I went to the drawer by the phone and pulled out the list of numbers I had written over the past few weeks, the ones from my quiet research, the legal aid office, the county assessor, the title registry. I dialed the first one. A woman's voice answered, patient and efficient, asking how she could help. I explained that I was the homeowner, that my property might have been restructured without my consent, that someone had been forwarding my mail. She didn't laugh, didn't dismiss me. She asked for my address and said she would check public records. Her tone was neutral, professional, but there was something human beneath it, something that steadied me. She called back 2 hours later. The house, she confirmed, was still listed in my name, though a change of interest request had been filed 2 weeks ago, an incomplete submission under review. My name was there, but so was Mark's, penciled into a section that should have remained blank. He can't finalize without your signature, she said. But he's trying. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat very still. The first feeling was not anger, but relief. Relief that I wasn't imagining things, that the erosion had been real, traceable. Then came a slow, clean fury that didn't burn so much as clarify. I made tea, not because I wanted it, but because I needed a ritual to contain the shaking in my hands. As I stirred the cup, I saw my reflection in the dark window. Hair thin, face pale, eyes still steady. I whispered to myself, he's trying, but I'm still here. The words were small, but they tasted like power. Over the next few days, I began moving differently through the house, quietly but with intention. I checked drawers, opened files, took photos of documents with my old phone. I made copies of the deed and stored them in different places. The neighbor's mailbox, my knitting bag, the freezer behind the bag of peas. I was methodical. Every morning after they left for work and school, I walked the perimeter of my home like a soldier reacquainting herself with terrain. I measured what was mine, not in possessions, but in presence. I started humming again while I cleaned. I caught myself laughing once when I dropped a spoon, and it clattered so loudly I startled myself. It had been months since laughter had sounded right in these rooms. One afternoon, I called my daughter's old friend, Helen, a retired nurse who still lived across town. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the funeral. She sounded surprised to hear from me, but her voice softened when she realized who it was. We talked for an hour about nothing and everything. Weather, aches, how quiet houses become when the people inside them stop talking. I almost hung up before saying what I needed to, but the words came out on their own. Helen, do you still have that envelope I gave you years ago? The one I said to keep safe? There was a pause, then a low laugh. Of course, Em. I don't throw away things people hand me like that. My chest tightened. That envelope contained a copy of the original purchase documents George had insisted we duplicate in case Banks ever went strange. I told her I might need it soon. "You let me know when," she said. "I'll bring it myself." I hung up feeling steadier than I had in months. The next morning, I woke early, before sunrise. The house was wrapped in silence, soft and uncertain, the way things are before a storm. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same one George mentioned in his letter, and spread the papers before me. Deed, tax receipts, insurance, all proof of what I already knew. But this time, I wasn't just reading them. I was studying them like scripture. Every line, every clause, every stamp that tied my name to this ground became an affirmation. I realized that power doesn't always come from loudness. Sometimes it comes from knowing, quietly and completely, what is yours. When Mark came downstairs that morning, I greeted him differently. Not with hostility or pretense, just with a kind of stillness that made him pause. "Morning," he said, cautious. I looked up from my coffee and replied, "Good morning, Mark. I spoke with the county assessor yesterday. They confirmed something interesting." He froze, a flicker of something, fear, calculation, passing through his expression. "Oh?" he asked, tone too light. "Yes," I said, holding his gaze. "They said someone tried to add a name to my title. I told them that was impossible." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched. Finally, he said, "You must be mistaken." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "I'm not." Then I turned back to my coffee. The sound of the clock filled the room. When he left for work, I heard the tightness in his steps. That was the first time in years that he looked uncertain in this house. After that morning, things became both easier and sharper. He stopped addressing me in the falsely gentle tone. Instead, there was distance, formality, as though I'd graduated from nuisance to threat. He started locking his office door when he left, and I pretended not to notice. Ethan grew more sullen, caught between loyalty and confusion. Once I overheard him telling a friend on the phone that things at home were weird. I almost wanted to tell him it wasn't weird. It was justice rearranging its furniture. The more control Mark tried to assert, the calmer I became. I cooked again, not for them, but for myself. I played George's old records while I dusted, letting the crackle of vinyl fill the air like memory turned sound. The music reminded me of who I'd been before I became a caretaker, a widow, a burden. I had been a woman once, funny, stubborn, certain. That woman was still here, hiding beneath layers of politeness and fatigue. Each day, I felt her stretching a little more, testing her limbs. Then, one evening in June, the power went out during dinner. Mark cursed softly, fumbling for his phone flashlight. I lit a candle and sat back, oddly serene in the flicker. Without electricity, the house returned to itself, quiet, human, stripped of screens. Ethan looked up from his plate and asked, "Grandma, did you ever have nights like this when you were young?" His voice wasn't mocking. It was curious, tentative. "Many," I said. "We used to tell stories to pass the time." He smiled faintly. "What kind?" I thought for a moment. "Stories about people who forgot their blessings," I said, "and the ones who reminded them." He didn't answer, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition or discomfort, I couldn't tell. After they went to bed, I sat alone in the candlelight, the shadows of the oak tree swaying across the walls. I thought about the decades I'd spent believing patience was virtue, when maybe it was just fear in polite clothing. George's words echoed in my head. "Don't let anyone make you small inside it." I realized then that I'd been waiting for permission to reclaim what was mine. waiting for decency to return on its own. But decency, I was learning, rarely comes back unless you drag it home yourself. The next morning, I walked downtown to the law office that had handled our original mortgage. The receptionist was young, kind, with sharp nails and a cautious smile. When I explained who I was and what I needed, she nodded and said one of the senior partners, an old friend of George's, apparently, could see me later that week. I thanked her and walked home slowly, my cane tapping the pavement in steady rhythm. It was the first time in years I had gone somewhere without asking or informing anyone. I realized, halfway back, that I wasn't even tired. That night, when Mark asked where I'd been, I said simply, "Out." He waited for more, but I gave him nothing. He tried to smile, but it faltered. I could feel the balance shifting, subtle, but irreversible. Later, in bed, I lay awake and thought about the word out. How small it was, how powerful. Out of the house, out of the cage. Out of the story he'd been writing about me. For the first time in a long time, I felt not old, not invisible, but possible. The moonlight touched the edges of the curtains, pale and deliberate, like approval. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm not leaving, George. I'm coming back." And for the first time in years, I believed it. The weeks that followed were a strange kind of calm, like the quiet air before a thunderstorm, when the sky still pretends it's blue, but the birds already know to hide. I went through the motions of my days with an outward stillness that made Mark uneasy. He didn't understand that silence, when it belongs to a woman who has seen everything, is not surrender, but preparation. I kept my routine simple. Breakfast at 7, a walk to the end of the street, a bit of sweeping, a few calls to lawyers and offices that I made when he wasn't around. Every piece of information I gathered became a small brick in the wall I was building between their plans and my reality. I learned more about property law than I ever thought I'd need to. I learned that ownership, much like dignity, only disappears when you stop defending it. Mark tried to reassert control in ways that looked like kindness to anyone who didn't know better. He brought home new locks for the back door, saying it was for safety, and hired a cleaning service without asking, 2 young women who came every Friday and treated me like part of the furniture. They would vacuum around my chair, never looking me in the eye. I didn't mind the intrusion. I was cataloging everything. Every receipt, every bill, every message he left on the counter with his clipped handwriting that said, "Just a reminder, Inspection Monday." He thought paperwork was power, but paperwork, in the right hands, is also evidence. Ethan had started summer classes at the community college, though he rarely spoke about them. His absence was a relief and a wound. Some evenings I heard him laughing in his room, a sound that carried me back to the boy he used to be, and I felt that familiar ache of loving someone who no longer loves you in return. I tried once to speak to him, to bridge whatever canyon had opened between us. I caught him in the kitchen, pouring cereal for dinner, and said softly, "You know, your mother used to do that when she was your age. She said it saved time." He looked up, halfway between boy and man, and for an instant I saw her in his face. But then he shrugged and said, "Dad says you shouldn't move around so much. You could fall." The words weren't his. They were borrowed, repeated. I smiled anyway, though my chest felt hollow. "Don't worry," I said. "I've been falling and getting up longer than you've been alive." He gave a small laugh, not unkind, but distant, and left the room. The following Monday, Mark came home early. I was in the garden trimming the rose bushes when I heard the crunch of gravel and the slam of his car door. He walked toward me with that measured gait of his, the one that said he'd made a decision. "Em," he began, his voice falsely calm, "we need to talk." He gestured toward the house. I followed him inside, brushing soil from my hands. At the table, a folder waited, neatly closed, the kind of folder that promises unpleasantness. He opened it and pushed a document toward me. "It's an agreement," he said. "A precaution, really. Just to make sure things are organized if something happens to you. You'd still live here, of course, but legally it would simplify matters." His tone was so reasonable, it could have fooled anyone who didn't hear the undertone of calculation. I looked at the papers, dense paragraphs of legal phrasing, and saw, in one section, my name alongside his under the word trustee. I didn't touch the document. "You don't need my signature for convenience," I said quietly. "You need it because you know this house isn't yours." He stiffened, but recovered quickly. "Em, you're misunderstanding. This is to protect you, to protect Ethan's future." I laughed, soft and sharp. "Ethan's future isn't built on stealing his grandmother's past." The words surprised even me. His face flushed, a dark bloom of anger rising under his polite mask. "You're making this difficult," he said. "You've been confused lately, forgetting things, misplacing bills. I'm trying to help before something happens that can't be fixed." The calm that came over me then was almost unnatural. I stood, hands steady, and said, "You've mistaken endurance for confusion. I've been quiet because I thought grief had taught you humility. I see now it's only taught you greed." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, the faintest shadow of shame quickly buried. "You need rest," he said, his voice tightening. "You're exhausted." Then, as if to remind himself of control, he gathered the papers back into the folder. "I'll give you a few days to think it over." He turned to leave, but I stopped him with one sentence. "Don't bring me anything else to sign, Mark. The next paper I handle will have your name leaving this address." After he left the room, I felt my knees tremble. I sank into the nearest chair, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was not a woman built for confrontation, not anymore. But that moment rewired something in me. There's a strength that comes from youth and health, and then there's another kind, older, colder, born from surviving long enough to see the pattern of cruelty repeat. I'd carried both kinds in my life, and now the second was waking fully. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the echo of his voice, that quiet insistence on confusion, as if age were a disease that stripped away your rights, one courtesy at a time. I got out of bed and opened the window. The oak tree outside was heavy with summer leaves, its branches moving slowly in the dark. The moonlight spilled across my floor in pale ribbons. I whispered to the tree the way I once whispered to George. "They think I'm fading, but I'm not," I said. "I'm remembering." The next morning, I called Helen and asked her to bring the envelope she'd kept all these years. She arrived that afternoon, her gray hair pinned neatly, her eyes bright with concern. We sat together at the kitchen table, two old women who had seen too much and were no longer willing to pretend otherwise. She slid the envelope toward me. "You were right to keep a copy," she said. "Men forget promises faster than paper burns." We laughed, and for a moment I felt like myself again, the version of me that used to tell stories at church dinners and organize bake sales. I opened the envelope and pulled out the documents, dated, notarized, mine. I placed them next to the newer copies Mark had been tampering with. The difference was obvious. My signature in ink, his name nowhere. I felt a surge of vindication that made my fingers tingle. Helen looked around the house and shook her head. "He's made himself comfortable," she said softly. "Comfort can turn to ownership in a man's mind faster than you'd believe," I replied. She stayed for tea, and when she left, she hugged me tightly. "Don't let him win, Em," she said. "You've earned your peace." I promised her I wouldn't. The confrontation that followed came sooner than I expected. That evening, when Mark returned and saw Helen's car leaving the driveway, his expression changed. "Who was that?" he asked. "An old friend," I said simply. He frowned. "You're bringing outsiders into private family matters now?" I tilted my head. "You made them family matters when you tried to take my house." His jaw tightened, and he exhaled through his nose. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You're being manipulated by people who don't understand the situation." "The situation," I said slowly, "is that you live here by my grace, and that grace has limits." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're making a mistake, Em. If you push me, I'll have to make some calls. There are professionals who handle these things, cognitive assessments, welfare evaluations. Once they get involved, you won't be making any decisions about property at all." It was a threat wrapped in care, exactly his style. I didn't react. I just looked at him the way you look at a child throwing a tantrum in a language he doesn't realize you speak fluently. "Make your calls," I said. "I'll be making mine too." His eyes narrowed. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "Neither do you," I said. And for the first time, he had no response. He left the room without slamming the door, which was somehow worse than if he had. 2 days later, a woman from social services arrived unannounced. She was polite, middle-aged, clipboard in hand, asking if she could speak with me privately. I invited her in, offered tea, and let her ask her questions. Did I feel safe? Was anyone helping me manage finances? Did I sometimes get confused about dates? I answered clearly, articulately, with every ounce of composure I possessed. I showed her my documents, my ledger, even the notes I'd taken during my calls with the county office. Her expression softened as she read. "You seem perfectly capable, Mrs. Porter," she said. "We sometimes get calls that turn out to be misunderstandings." I smiled faintly. "Yes," I said. "I imagine you do." When she left, she shook my hand and said, "If you ever feel pressured, call me directly." She handed me her card. I kept it. That evening, Mark avoided me completely. The air in the house had changed. The polite veneer was gone. I could feel his resentment like static, unspoken, but loud. Ethan, sensing the tension, grew quiet too. I caught him watching me once, uncertain, guilty, maybe. I didn't blame him. He was too young to see that indifference can be inherited. The pressure mounted over the next week. The thermostat suddenly stopped responding to my settings. The locks on the back door were replaced again without my permission. Even my mail began to disappear more frequently. Each small theft felt like another test, another attempt to see if I would falter. But I had already decided that fear was no longer part of the equation. I visited the law office again and met with the partner who had known George. He was in his 70s now, sharp-eyed and kind. After reviewing my documents, he leaned back and said, "Mrs. Porter, you have every legal right to your property. If he's living there without rent or contract, you can issue an eviction." I nodded slowly, the word eviction rolling through me like a bell. "We'll prepare the notice," he said. You'll need to deliver it in person or through certified mail. That night, I sat at my desk and signed the papers. My hand shook slightly, not from hesitation, but from the weight of it. I sealed the envelope, placed it beside the lamp, and stared at it for a long time. It wasn't triumph I felt. Not yet. It was something quieter, a deep, steady certainty that I had been waiting my whole life to remember. When Ethan came home later, I called him into the living room. "Sit with me for a moment," I said. He hesitated but obeyed. "Your mother loved this house," I told him. "Every wall, every window. She said it was alive because we loved it enough to make it so. Don't let anyone teach you that love and ownership are the same thing." He nodded, uneasy, eyes flicking toward the stairs. "Dad's doing what he thinks is best," he murmured. "Maybe," I said, "but good intentions don't excuse theft. You'll understand one day." After he went upstairs, I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, the house breathing quietly around me. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like exile. It felt like witness. The oak tree outside rustled, its leaves whispering against the siding as if applauding. I thought of George again, of the way he used to say that storms clear the air, that sometimes destruction is just the sky making room for light. The thunder hadn't come yet, but I could smell it on the wind. I knew it wouldn't be long now. The next morning, before the sun rose, I placed the eviction notice on the kitchen counter beneath Mark's mug. I brewed coffee, sat down, and waited. When he entered the room and saw the envelope, he froze. "What's this?" he asked. I didn't answer. He tore it open, scanned the page, and looked at me with disbelief. "You can't be serious," he said. "You can't do this." I met his eyes and said, "I can. I already have." The clock ticked once, twice. Then he laughed, sharp and humorless. "You'll regret this," he said. "You need us." I sipped my coffee and replied, "No, Mark. You need my house. I just need peace." He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. The sound echoed through the house, a sound that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Upstairs, I heard Ethan's door open, then close again. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway, the morning light spilling across the table. My hands were steady. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. I felt like its author again. The day the papers turned from threat to fact began without drama. A blunt blue morning after a night that never found sleep. And I moved through the kitchen with the calm of someone who has practiced the moment in her head until it fit like a glove, setting 2 cups on the counter because habit makes its own kind of music, though I knew only one would be used. And when the doorbell rang at 9 on the dot, I was already standing in the doorway with my cardigan buttoned and the deed in a neat folder tucked beneath my arm, like an old friend who had finally come home. On the stoop stood the deputy constable and a locksmith with a toolbox, the color of a faded bruise, and the deputy, a woman scarcely older than my daughter would have been, touched the brim of her hat and asked if I was Mrs. Emily Porter, and I said I was, and she said she had come to enforce an order of eviction lawfully served and pass the grace period, and would I like a moment before she entered, and I told her I had waited more than a moment, I had waited 3 years, and that if she wouldn't mind, we could begin in the living room, because that was where the offense had lived longest. Mark came down the stairs in a hurry, wearing that astonished indignation, particular to men who believed consequences were for other people, his hair uncombed, his tie in his fist, and he began with my name as if he could unspool the day by saying it sharply. But the deputy stepped forward. voice even, informing him she was there under court authority, and that he and his personal effects were to be removed under her supervision, that he could take clothing, electronics he could prove were his, and personal documents, that furniture was to remain unless he could produce a receipt. And he laughed that brittle laugh that used to make me feel small, and he said there had been a mistake, that I was confused, that family matters did not require strangers. And I watched his mouth work around the word family like it was a key he'd misplaced. And I realized in that second that nothing about this felt like cruelty to me. It felt like air finally finding a room where the window had stuck for years. He tried to coax the deputy into the kitchen to talk reason, offered to show her emails and texts and the brochure for the retirement home he had circled like a hymn book, and she listened with a composure I admired, then asked a short series of questions that landed like stones dropped into a well. Whose name on the deed? Who paid the property tax? Who had authorized lock changes without the owner's consent? And when his answers turned into the thin soup of maybe and I thought, and it's complicated. She turned back to me and said gently that the locksmith would begin at the rear entry and the garage side door, and would I like to sit? I told her I would prefer to stand, as standing had been denied me in small ways for too long, and while the locksmith knelt and his tools made small, secular prayers of metal against metal, Mark collected himself into anger and announced he would be calling his lawyer, and I told him mine had picked up on the first ring that morning and that he could call whomever he wished while he folded his shirts into a duffel. And he said I was making a spectacle, and I said that a spectacle is what people call clarity when it finally arrives in daylight. And he turned his anger toward Ethan, who had hovered in the hallway in the same t-shirt he slept in, hair a dark storm over his forehead. And Mark told him to go pack his things because we were leaving, all of us. And the boy looked at me, not past me, not through me, at me. And the years collapsed into the tender weight of the infant I had once held in the crook of my elbow while his mother slept. And he said very quietly, "Where are we going, Dad?" And the deputy, still calm, said that he was a legal adult and could choose where to go, that her order concerned only the unauthorized occupant, and Mark called it ridiculous and said the house needed him. And I felt the smallest smile flicker in my chest because finally the sentence stood naked in the room. Not me, not the boy, not the memory of my daughter, the house. There is a tone women learn to use when fear must be replaced by geometry, and I found it then, a slow, deliberate voice that made room for no misunderstanding. And I told Mark that a moving company would be arriving in 2 hours to collect whatever he could prove was his, that I had packed nothing for him because I had packed for men too many times in my life, that there was a form on the dining table listing items he had brought under my roof, verified by photographs I had taken in the spring, that the deputy had copies, that he could dispute later with lawyers, but that today the house would revert to its ordinary silence, and he said this was vindictive, and I said it was irrevocable. And the locksmith straightened and nodded once in my direction to say the first door was complete, and did I want new keys or the keypad code. And I chose keys because hands remember what dignity feels like when a weight lands in the palm. Ethan disappeared down the hall, and I thought he had gone to slam a door, but instead he returned with a small cardboard box, the kind grocery stores give you when the apples are finished, and inside were the photographs I had not been able to find for months. My daughter at graduation, George in his uniform, the small school picture of Ethan missing his front tooth. And he held the box toward me without flourish, as if this were simply the next necessary movement of the day, and I took it and said thank you, and felt the world tilt in that subtle way it does when someone rescues a piece of you without announcement. Mark moved from bluster to bargaining with the speed of a man, discovering the floor beneath him is not as solid as the story in his mouth, and he asked for more time, for a week, for a weekend, for overnight. And the deputy shook her head in the slow rhythm of inexorable procedure and said the notice had been served properly, and the date had passed, and today was the day. And in that phrasing, today was the day. I heard bells, wedding bells, funeral bells, all the bells that mark a human crossing, and while he dialed numbers and paced, I went to my room and opened the old lockbox and removed the packet I had prepared, the one that placed the deed into a living trust with my name as sole trustee and successor instructions to a small nonprofit that renovates houses for widows, and I placed the papers on the hall table so the house itself could see the ink, and I whispered to George that he could rest. The signatures were real, and the plans no longer lived only in my notebook, and when I returned to the living room, the deputy was explaining the inventory protocol, and Ethan sat on the stair halfway down, like someone unwilling to declare allegiance to gravity, and the oak outside threw a new shadow across the floor that looked very much like a road. The moving men arrived exactly when I had been told they would, courteous in the way people are when the story is clear and the work is defined, and they followed the list, and Mark argued over a lamp and a set of mixing bowls and a painting that was a print he had bought online, and the deputy said no to the lamp and yes to the bowls and no to the painting, and each yes and no was a metronome keeping time for the end of an old song. And in the midst of this orchestration, he tried a final maneuver, stepping close to me, lowering his voice to that intimate register he used the week after the funeral, asking if this was what my daughter would have wanted. And I felt the cruelty of it land and then slide off, like rain on a roof properly pitched, and I told him my daughter would have wanted her mother seen, and her son taught the difference between help and harm, and that whatever else we could not know, we could know that. And he went pale and said he would ruin me for this, and I said I had already been ruined and rebuilt, and that this house had survived termites and wind, and the small apocalypse of a little girl leaving for college and never quite coming back, and it would survive a man with a folder. At noon, the locksmith finished the front door and placed the new keys in my hand with a little ceremony I will remember when my body forgets everything else. And the deputy asked me to test the lock, and I closed the door and turned the key and opened it again, and something inside my chest answered with an old gladness, not triumph. Something older, the relief of a thing set back on its hinge, and when I looked up, Ethan was watching my hand, not with hostility, with attention, and he said, in a voice so quiet I nearly missed it, "Grandma, can I stay for a few days while I figure things out?" And Mark barked his name as if it were a leash, but the deputy, bless her, cleared her throat and said the young man was an adult and his choice was his. And the boy's eyes moved from his father's face to mine, and he said again, stronger, "Can I stay?" And I told him yes. He could stay as a guest under the rules of the house, and the word guest felt clean on my tongue because it had been used against me, and now it was made new. And I added that we would talk later about rent and chores, and the kitchen and the television, and the view that was no longer his to guard, and he nodded as if accepting terms of peace he hadn't realized he wanted. By 2, the rooms had exhaled, the movement of boxes and footsteps weakening into the ordinary motions of a day, and Mark stood on the porch with his duffel, and the deputy beneath the shade of the oak gave him the paper that said what needed saying in the language he respected: dates, codes, signatures, and he tried to hand the keys he no longer possessed back to a door that no longer knew his hand. And there was a moment when the past appeared in his face, a softening that might have been the boy he once was when my daughter fell in love with him in the bleachers, and he said my name without sharpness and asked if I was sure, and I said that certainty is the mercy age grants those who have waited too long, and he went down the steps and into the small weather of a man who has lost a war. He thought was a conversation, and the deputy touched my elbow and told me to call if there were further issues, and that the office would process the completion. And then they were gone, and the house was so suddenly quiet that I had to sit. I did not weep, not for victory or for grief, because the body can hold only so much water, and mine had already spent a sea. But I did something I had not done in years. I walked to the center of the living room and stood exactly where the television's glare used to dictate the furniture, and I turned, slow as a clock's patient hand, and I looked at the room with the eyes I had when I first stepped into it, in a summer dress with sawdust in my hair, and I said aloud to the walls and the floor and the ceiling, to the oak and the photograph box, and to whatever part of George lingers in a house that refuses to forget, "It's over." And the words did not echo. They settled. They made a home. And then I called the nonprofit and scheduled the first appointment to discuss the trust and the repairs the house had been asking for in its creaks and sighs. And I baked a small cake, not because anyone would clap or because a camera would capture it, but because sugar and heat and time know how to mark a threshold. And when Ethan came down at dusk with his backpack and a cautious apology that belonged to him and not to his father, we ate the cake with our hands at the counter, no plates, and I told him there would be no television that night, that we would open the windows and listen to the tree and tell a story about a woman who learned to stand in her own living room. And he nodded. And when the first stars found the glass, I felt the house stand with me, not as a fortress, as a body remembering its breath. And the night that rose around us was not a curtain. It was a sky that had been waiting for this exact hour to lift. The silence that followed was not the kind that pressed on the chest, but the kind that expanded it. It had a texture, almost a weight, the sound of air finding its way back into spaces it had been forbidden to enter. The house smelled faintly of paint and lemon oil, because that morning I had wiped the baseboards myself, not out of duty, but from an instinct to begin again. Light came through the curtains differently now, cleaner, slower, as if the house too were catching its breath. Every morning I woke before dawn, made coffee, and stood at the window watching the oak tree trace its slow conversations with the wind. It looked healthier than it had in years. Maybe that's what happens when the roots are no longer being walked on by strangers pretending to belong. Mark did not return. There were phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize, emails that went unanswered, and finally a letter from his lawyer offering to discuss an amicable resolution. I placed it in a drawer and left it there. The law had spoken, and I had no appetite for further explanations. There is a strange peace in knowing you have already said the last necessary word. Ethan stayed, at least for a while. At first, he moved through the house as if it were haunted, apologizing in small gestures rather than sentences, fixing the loose hinge on the back door, replacing the light bulb in the hallway, mowing the lawn without being asked. We didn't talk about the day his father left, and that was mercy for both of us. Some wounds prefer the quiet, but over time, his silence softened. He started asking about his mother, about what she was like before illness turned her delicate and distant. I told him about the time she painted her room purple at 14 and declared herself a poet, about how she once saved a stray dog and hid it under her bed for a week, about her laugh that came out in bursts that startled the birds outside. He listened the way children listen when they want to build a memory they never had. Sometimes, in the middle of my stories, he would look away quickly, pretending to check his phone, and I would pretend not to notice. The rhythm of the house settled into something close to companionship. We ate dinner together at the table again. Not every night, but often enough for the sound of 2 forks against plates to feel like a form of music. I learned that he liked to cook, that he was studying architecture, that he was better at fixing things than his father ever was. Once I caught him staring at the living room walls, tracing lines in the air with his fingers, and he said he'd like to design houses one day that didn't make people feel small. I didn't say anything, just reached out and touched his arm lightly. I thought, perhaps, that would be enough of an answer. Some afternoons, after he left for class, I would sit with my tea and sort through the old photographs. I framed some of them again, the one of George by the river, my daughter in her cap and gown, even the one of Ethan with the missing tooth. They went back on the mantel where they belonged, not as trophies of survival, but as reminders that I had lived entire lives before this one. The house no longer felt like a museum of grief, but a breathing thing that could hold memory without drowning in it. I even painted the front door yellow, a soft shade like the walls of my bedroom, and when the neighbors asked why, I told them it was to invite back the sunlight. Helen came to visit on Sundays. We would sit on the porch, our knees wrapped in blankets even on warm days, because old habits cling the way ivy does. She'd bring muffins, and I'd make tea, and we'd talk about the strangeness of being invisible for so long that when people finally see you, it almost hurts. Once she said, "You seem lighter, Em." I told her it wasn't lightness. It was the absence of weight. Freedom is not a balloon. It's a quiet exhale after you've been holding your breath for years. At night, after Ethan went to bed, I wrote in a notebook I kept by the lamp. Not a ledger this time, no lists of small disappearances, but letters. To George, to my daughter, sometimes even to myself. I wrote about the quiet victories that no one witnesses, changing a lock, standing in sunlight, eating alone without loneliness. I wrote about the things I had learned too late and the things I was still learning. The pages filled slowly, unevenly, but the act of writing felt like stitching a torn seam. The words didn't have to be beautiful. They just had to be true. There was one entry I read back often, written on a night when rain drummed against the windows and the oak shivered under the weight of it. They thought old age meant retreat, I had written. They didn't know it could also mean arrival. We spend our youth collecting things, approval, company, furniture, plans, and then, if we're lucky, old age teaches us how to give them all back until only the essential remains: a chair, a view, a name no one can take. Reading those words made me feel as if I had spoken with a version of myself I might one day meet again, older still, but not diminished. A few months after Mark left, a letter arrived addressed to Ethan. He read it in the kitchen, standing by the counter, his jaw tightening as he scanned the lines. I didn't ask what it said, but after a long silence, he looked up and said, "Dad wants me to visit. He says he's sorry." I waited, then said, "Do you want to go?" He shrugged. "I think so. I need to see for myself who he is now." I nodded. "Then go. You don't owe anyone anger." He smiled a little, And for the first time, I saw the man he might become. Someone who understood that forgiveness isn't weakness, but a way to stop carrying other people's burdens. When he left that weekend, the house was quiet again, but it wasn't the lonely kind of quiet. It was the earned kind, the peace that follows understanding. Sometimes, I still hear echoes. A chair scraping the floor, the thud of feet on the stairs, a voice calling my name from another room. They don't frighten me anymore. Memory is just the house keeping me company. And on days when the ache of years feels heavier than usual, I sit by the window and imagine George sitting beside me, his hand warm over mine. I tell him about everything he missed. The screens, the arguments, the eviction, the recovery. And I tell him, too, about the small joys that returned. The way the sunlight bends through the window at noon. The way Ethan's laugh sometimes sounds like his mother's. The way the oak's shadow stretches across the floor each afternoon like a promise that nothing rooted deeply ever truly leaves. I don't know how many more years I'll have here, and it no longer matters. I used to think longevity was the goal, to stay alive long enough for someone to notice. But survival isn't about counting years. It's about reclaiming the right to be the subject of your own story. When people walk by my house now, they see a tidy yard, a bright door, a woman who waves from her porch. They don't see the history beneath the paint, and they don't need to. This house and I know what we endured. The oak knows. George knows. I sometimes imagine another woman, maybe my age, sitting somewhere tonight, moving aside because someone younger has told her she's in the way. I imagine her heart shrinking with the quiet humiliation of it. And if I could speak to her, if my voice could reach across that silence, I would tell her this. Don't move. Don't apologize for existing in the space you built. You are not blocking the view. You are the view. And when you finally stand still long enough, the world will have to learn how to look at you again. The nights are longer now, but they are gentle. I sleep with the window open, the sound of the oak rustling like breath. Somewhere inside, the house hums its low, steady gratitude. The air smells faintly of lemon and rain. I dream of beginnings that feel like endings and endings that open like doors. And in every dream, I am exactly where I belong. Standing in my living room, unafraid, surrounded by the quiet that no longer means absence, but peace.